Next, we come to a story that was almost the Muppet of the Month this month, but this was uh, so bizarre that it was very nearly Muppet of the Month. And this is the story of a family who took it upon themselves to ignore the presence of a DMV, deserted medieval village. Although isn't DMV like a traffic thing in America? I often hear it on The Simpsons, DMV. Um, no, no, no.
I'm not going to get involved in what's going on across the Atlantic.
But nonetheless, a deserted
Too
medieval
complicated,
deserted medieval village in
particularly
Withybrooke
with an election going on at the moment. I'm still trying to get to grips with what happened on Super Tuesday.
in Withybrooke in Warwickshire, um, where John and Heather Mack, 58 and 61 respectively, and their daughter Elizabeth continued to dig up land and build a 13-foot wide track, destroying parts of a 12th century monument. They also installed a water pipe, troughs, gate posts, etc. between 2015 and 2018. The metro link that we have here shows how much they had the landscape changed during the course of their work over those 3 or 4 years. And I, sup-
Yeah.
I suppose that this is part of a well, actually, as you identified, seems to be almost part of a trend in the news at the moment that's laying groundwork for a generalized sense of rules regarding land ownership, management, and protections. Uh, and it felt a little bit as though our conversation about this was moving away from simply going, grrr at this family who are, for example, in the Rugby advertiser described as being remorseless and having been ordered to pay £160,000 following a cynical act of vandalism, and towards a more general conversation about, well, there's stuff in the air, isn't there, with regards to protection rules and regulations, isn't there?
Yeah. Now, okay. Let's put this in context. I mean, I'm certainly aware of, and I'm sure you are, aware of landowners, farmers, who are concerned that if a site is discovered on their land, they won't be able to farm in the way that they want to farm.
Hmm.
I know of one particular case where, for example, the uh, landowner would have withdrawn permission for a walkover survey and monitor metal detecting if the site was then notified to Historic England.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and at that point, I withdrew from any involvement in it.
Right. Okay.
So this kind of stuff goes on. Being crude about it, there's anyone that knows Viz. There's Farmer Palmer, whose catchphrase is "Get off my land," and there's an element of this about the way this particular group of people
Yes.
have been described. I'm quoting here directly from this is in quotation marks, as coming from Historic England,
Hmm.
reporting the court case. The damage was first brought to the attention of Historic England by residents, i.e. it was reported, they didn't find it themselves.
No.
It then says, despite written and verbal warnings from Historic England inspectors and Rugby Borough Council planning enforcement, the Macs took no steps to reduce or minimise harm to the site and did not assist with Historic England's investigation. And continuing the quote, the works were not committed by accident or through acts of road contractors, they were deliberate and sustained. All three knew the site was protected and was their responsibility in safeguarding its significance. And then it quotes again a local councillor, so that you've got Historic England on board here. You've also got the local authority, the local planning authority on board here. You've got, this is Councillor Jill Simpson-Vince, who's the council portfolio holder for, interestingly, growth and investment, not culture.
Hmm.
She said, this cynical act of cultural vandalism has caused irreparable damage to a protected historic site of national importance, and the severity of the fines imposed by the judge sends a clear message to landowners who choose to ignore advice from our planning team and flout the law. Now, this comes on the back of another case in Somerset where Historic England prosecuted a farmer who damaged a Neolithic henge.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, the argument is whether these cases are becoming more common, or whether, in fact, Historic England and the authorities are becoming more proactive about actually prosecuting them and prosecuting them as far as they can. And I think it's probably the latter.
Yeah.
Historic England, in the last few years, they've taken on a policing advisor, who's a man called Mark Harrison, used to be a chief inspector with the Kent Constabulary. And I have to declare an interest here. I know Mark, and I've worked with him on a couple of projects.
Well,
But
you know another Mark?
that
Oh, goodness me. Sorry, go on.
yeah,
Does he spell his name with a C as well?
It does get it. No, he doesn't actually.
Okay.
So no, the point is that that appointment was part of a very specific pivot in policy to being much more proactive about pursuing what's now dubbed, and even has his own hashtag, heritage crime.
Yeah.
Which
is also
and
so go on. Sorry.
No, all I was going to say is, and what HE have been doing is developing practice in researching, investigating, and then prosecuting all levels of heritage crime, from antisocial behaviour right through to the top end. Things like this, damage to the historic, severe physical damage to the historic environment. Or the recent case of the metal detectorists and the antiquities dealer who have been jailed for the laundering of a Viking hoard, with the Leinster hoard, which we talked about, I think, in a previous watching brief.
Well, and also actually very recently there was the story of the chap, I think at Oxford University, wasn't there, who was selling material that he shouldn't have been selling, and essentially it's all becoming much more.
That's the London.
Yeah, much more serious, and also we've lumped in to this segment a headline from the Guardian: illegal metal detecting at English heritage sites doubles in the past 2 years. Public has been urged to help tackle rise in night hawking, also known as looting, blamed on organised crime, which is interesting actually. This idea that now this notion of organised crime, is this, do you think, actually a reference to the subculture of, for example, detecting rallies, or do you think that actually this is actually something that, in the same way that literally gangs from cities have moved into, for example, stealing farming equipment and animals, is this actually an offset for that, or is it more about organised as in organised rallies?
Okay, I think people who organise metal detecting rallies would argue very strongly that what they do is perfectly legal and their hobby is perfectly legal. Archaeologists will take views on whether it should be, and whether it should, whether there should be additional restrictions on metal detecting, and particularly on metal detecting rallies. That's another issue for another day. There is evidence emerging, but it's early days yet. There is evidence emerging that certainly organised in the sense of a group of people setting out to illegally metal detect and steal artifacts does happen.
So, and in that sense, it's possibly circumvent procedures around, for example, notifying the coroner, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Or simply going onto land without permission, trespassing.
Yeah.
But trespassing and then committing theft, effectively. It's almost like the metal detecting equivalent of breaking and entering. In that you're stealing somebody else's property. There is evidence that I've looked at least one case myself where arguably there was a conspiracy to steal, because it was a group of people getting together, going to a specific place where there was no permission to metal detect. and recovering material.
Mm.
Now that happened to be for personal collections rather than for sale by and large, but there's certainly anecdotal evidence of people travelling across the country to metal detecting various finds hotspots,
Yeah.
and to recover material for sale.
Mm-hmm.
So, what we don't know at the moment, I think, is the extent of the problem.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
a metal detecting groups, if you look at Facebook and things like that, and also the National Council for Metal Detecting and other lobby groups, like to talk about legitimate metal detectorists and quote nighthawks. I never use the word. They're thieves who use metal detectors.
Yeah. Yeah.
But being almost like a separate thing. I suspect probably the truth is a lot more complicated and more nuanced than that, because it's a very complex subculture, metal detecting.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we're only just getting to grips, I think, with the complexities of it and the ongoing issues around it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, your man, the other Mark, is quoted in the Guardian article. Actually, he rounds it off, and he makes probably a very good round off for us as well,
Yeah,
by saying that this is not a victimless crime. As he
yeah,
says, we may never see or fully understand the objects taken or damaged because they have been removed from their original sites with no care or record as to their history or context. And this is it's interesting because there was a light conversation surrounding this, for example, on the Archaeosuit Facebook page,
mm,
where and it always comes up whenever metal detecting. It's a very common theme in news. Um, a conversation surrounding rights to have a hobby, for example,
yeah,
and rights to dig land that you own. This is particularly strong, a strong feeling in the US that I've come
oh yeah,
across, um,
yeah.
and quite rightly, ownership is a thing. I'm not suggesting it shouldn't be a thing,
It's the
but
basis of English common law.
well, precisely, yeah, precisely. So I'm not remotely suggesting that yeah, I'm not extreme in that sense, in terms of and counter ownership, but really, ultimately, one of the problems that I think that archaeologists and people like Mark Harrison are now having to try and tackle is the raw perception that the value of what we're looking at begins and ends with the object outside its
Yeah,
context and outside its actual story. And so, in that sense, archaeology, and I've said this in the past as well. We are stuff obsessed. We're equally interested in stuff as is a metal detector. The difference is what we do with that stuff and how that stuff helps to tell a broader story. And by all
and
means,
also this, but also, I mean, I think crucially here that the soil that stuff was in,
yeah,
and does that tell us, does that tell us an environmental story as well as an artifact, a story based on the artifact itself, and so on.
yeah,
Um, you know, it that's the difference,
yeah, precisely. That is
and the
that.
fact that yeah,
That is
and the fact that our individual archaeologists working in mainstream archaeology don't own the things that they find, don't want to own the things that they find,
no,
and also publish as widely as possible what they find.
precisely.